Understanding our values will give us the greatest probability of actually putting ourselves in the right position to then have more favorable mental health outcomes. Burnout, depression, all of these mental health outcomes are going to be symptoms in many cases of unfulfilled or incongruent values.
If you're not clear on your values, you are much more highly susceptible to take on other people's values.
When we're taking action on things that aren't truly authentic to us, where we're not truly aligned, ultimately it's a recipe for disaster or an emotional roller coaster.
If you're living from what matters most for you and you've worked out what those things are, then your life is radically different.
Greg, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, mate. Yeah, looking forward to getting into these episodes.
Absolutely. So, we were just speaking off camera, some foundational episodes for the listeners today. We're going to be doing a 3-part series on the values or purpose priorities framework that I use with clients, really helping people get clear on what are their values, what does give them that sense of purpose, and then ultimately how to build a life around that. So today's episode is going to be everything around how our values shape our thoughts, our behaviors, our actions. In the following episode, I'm going to be sitting down with a client one-on-one, and I'm actually going to take them through that process so viewers can see that practically and gain the tools to get clear on that. And in the third episode, hopefully I'm going to link back up with you, and we're going to actually give listeners some tools and strategies around how they can build their life around what's most important to them with those insights. How are you feeling about it?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. The values piece, I think, is massive because as you've talked about, we always live out from our values and what we value most. I think that journey of working out what are your values, for a business, whether it's, they're on the wall and they look nice, but no one actually lives them, or whether it's personally, you say you value things, but actually your life's quite different. I think it's a massive topic and one to dive into, foundationally, because if you get that right, if you're living from what matters most for you and you've worked out what those things are, then your life is radically different. So I'm looking forward to drawing that out from you and for the listeners as well.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, and look, as we said, such a foundational episode. I think I wanted to make sure that we do this 3-part series early on, because you'll find if you're a listener to the show, it's going to be a consistent theme that we're going through. And we're all about practical solutions. And so actually taking the time to go through this 3-part series, I think will be absolutely transformational for anyone who listens to it. From my perspective, just a little bit about the why, Greg, and I'm curious what you think as well. But from my perspective, not only in my own life, but with the clients I work with, friends, colleagues, I think we all know someone, perhaps ourselves, that, we're unclear on our direction. Perhaps we're comparing ourselves to others, or perhaps we're beating ourselves up because we're not taking the actions that we think or we perceive that we should be. Keyword should. So, today is really going to be about why it's important to know the values, because so many of us, so much of our mental health challenges, our depression, our anxiety, the goals that we don't achieve are based on that misalignment or lack of clarity with our values.
Yeah, massive. Well, I think it'd be a great place to get into the foundational piece of what values actually are. How would you describe values?
Well, how about I start with what they're not?
Right.
I'll flip it, if you like, what they're not. So most people, when they think of values, they tend to think, trust, love, integrity, these things that sound good out loud, but what do they truly mean? Or, perhaps how do they truly actually inform our lives? So the sort of joke that I say to my clients is, I've never met anyone who wakes up in the morning, I can't wait to show more honesty today. I can't wait to show more integrity today. And the reason I lead with that is it's not that, honesty or integrity isn't important, but that these aren't the things that actually drive our decisions, right? So, when I show up to this episode with you, Greg, I'm not thinking, how can I be more honest with Greg? How can I show integrity? I'm thinking, or I'm influenced by, whether I know it or not, that I love problem solving, that I love understanding, that I love helping people build things and build out their life. And so my decisions and my investment in this episode is coming from, that place ultimately, not, trust, love, integrity, honesty. Those are important things, but that will be a byproduct, I would suggest, of me living those values. So it's not the morals or the idealisms or society's values. We're talking about what gives us that sense of purpose.
Right. So if they're not those things, I've picked up there that there's kind of societal norms of
Hmm.
love or trust or integrity or those sort of things. If they're not those things, then what are they? You know,
Yeah.
how do we work out what ours truly are? And you gave some examples there of problem solving. You know, one of
Mm.
your ones that is, that really lights you up or energizes you. It's a place that you live from.
Mm.
What is someone's actual value if it's not an espoused value or a one they've picked up?
Yeah, absolutely. So to give some full context there, hash that out a little bit. The best way to think about it is we all live by a set of priorities, the things that are most important in our life to least important. Okay, so we can call these values, we can call these priorities. I use the word values and priorities interchangeably. When I'm working with clients, I call them, their purpose priorities. So we're talking about what are the priorities that give them that sense of purpose.
Mm.
So we're talking about the things that are most important to least important. And these are the things, Greg, that when we're taking action on these values or priorities or we're living them, we come alive. We have more energy, more focus, more reliability. No one needs to remind me, or hopefully you, if you're aligned, to show up and do this episode, right? Because it represents something that is inherently meaningful to us when we're living our values, a bit of a recap almost from some prior episodes, we don't need motivation. It's actually driven from within. So we don't need this external stimulus to get it across the line because it's important to us. Okay. So the values are the things that dictate what we do, what we don't do, the things that we prioritize versus the things that we procrastinate for or don't perhaps end up prioritizing. And interestingly enough, Greg, believe it or not, and this was going to be a segue we're going to do later, but I'll grab onto it now, is our values actually come from voids. So by a void, it is the perception of what we perceive as most missing, most unfulfilled, or essentially most uncompleted in our lives. So for example, if I love problem solving or helping others, I obviously perceive that I can reach more people in doing that. Or perhaps I perceive that I can solve higher level problems for individuals, for that to be a priority for me. I had a client recently, and they were telling me how they felt like they weren't able to do the travel and the experiences that they wanted growing up and with their parents, and so that's very important to them now, right? So the things that we perceive have been most missing in our life, consciously or unconsciously, meaning we're aware of it or not, become what's most important in our life. So whether we realize it or not, the things that we perceive are missing, whether we can name them or not, become the things that are the most meaningful to us. And those values, those priorities dictate, again, the actions we take, the actions we don't take, and ultimately shape our whole identity and outcomes in life.
That was so helpful. You saying that they energize you. That
Mm.
you can have what you call values, but actually, if they don't energize you, then maybe they're not your true values. Would you say that that's a good way to start with? Going, is this actually my value, or where is this coming from?
Yeah.
If it doesn't energize me, and I actually need to keep motivating myself
Mhm.
to say this is something that I value.
Absolutely. So interestingly, and we said earlier today that obviously, episode 2, following on directly from here that we'll release shortly, is going to be a practical episode where actually I'm going to take the viewers through the purpose priorities process I use, and we'll actually run them through that, with a client of mine so they can see that. But the reason I say that, Greg, is because, yes, one of the questions in that process is what gives you the most energy. Okay.
Mm.
The questions are very much designed around not what you think they should be, right? Not what sounds good out loud, but again, what do your actions demonstrate? So we want to look at actions, not words, going back to that old adage. So, uh, actions are revealing. And the process very much looks at, what gives you energy, where are you most organized, what do you love to learn about, what do you love to talk about? And you'll find that you start to see the consistent themes coming out.
Mm.
Okay. And so, again, that's what's going to be following this episode. But yes, to your point, the energy is one of my favorite questions because it's quite even hopefully now the audience might be able to start listening, thinking even just now quickly, what does give me energy? And oftentimes, if you look deeper, there'll be certain things that give you, maximal energy or 10 out of 10. And there'll be certain things that, a little bit of energy all the way down to things that drain your energy. And even that is going to be an expression of your values. So, for
Mm.
example, yes, I love working with clients. Yes, I love problem solving. Well, the best sort of client for me is a client that obviously doesn't want to just sit there and go through the same old stories that are keeping them stuck, but actually wants to get to the bottom of these challenges. So, in me knowing that my highest value is problem solving or helping understand things, I can make wiser decisions about the sort of clients that I work with, and then
Hmm.
obviously reap the benefit of more energy. So you can get me on multiple rabbit holes here, Greg, on each of the questions. But yes, the energy is a huge part of it, where you basically see, the most authentic, best side of yourself.
Awesome. I could imagine as for myself too, but I imagine for the listeners, it's encouraging to know that if you're lacking energy, and not that it's the single fix, but to know that there's a good potential that you're not aligned or living your values if you consistently lack energy to do that, to be able to get back in touch with and live out your values. But the other thing you mentioned that's massive, their values and voids. That would you say that it's mostly values that come from voids, or is it always being a strong word? Or
Yeah.
can you have just something that you value? Is that,
Mhm.
how strong is that correlation of having a void and then wanting its opposite or seeking to fill that?
Yeah, great question. So this might sound rather black and white, but the truth is it is black and white, and it is always. And one way to think about that is, even if you said, for example, perhaps family or your children is your highest value and the thing that really drives you and gives you that sense of purpose. And someone might say to me, "Well, Hayden, I've always had good parents. My kids are doing well, etc. There's no real void there or challenge, but it is clearly my highest value." And I can understand how they might think there's no corresponding void. But again, if we come back to the perception that it's not fully mastered or it's not quite fulfilled or they know there's
Mhm.
more they can do, right? And so that void principle does underlie all human values, and it's actually a beautiful thing if you think about it, right? It's the brain is trying to help you fulfill the things that you perceive are
Mm.
missing in your life. Even the word, fulfillment, filling the void. And so, yes, what we value does come from our voids. So the things that we look up to in life, we might look up to someone's, career or their financial position. We might look up to someone's travel that they've had. And the more when we look up to someone, we create a judgment or a split in our awareness to where we then seek to fulfill that in our own life. Okay, so the experiences we have in our life set up what we perceive as most incomplete, most missing, and then that ultimately translates to become what's most important in our life.
Yeah, powerful. There's something as well around. I think it's common, both for my own life and I'm sure for a lot of listeners, where we're relational beings. So when we're young, we have other people have values around us, and we can try and meet those values or perform for them. Is that something that you see that's really common, that you end up picking up someone else's values and they're not necessarily yours to start with, and
Mm,
it takes a while to work out what you actually value personally
yeah.
because it's so intertwined with the word you use was should.
Mm,
We're not asking what you think you should value, but
mm,
what do you actually value?
mm.
So how do you see that with taking on other people's values? Is that common?
Yeah, I would say that's probably the number one thing that I see the most. I mean, obviously the values, so much we can speak to today, right? Relationships, career, lack of clarity, the values impacts all of that. But yes, generally speaking, anytime we're not clear on our own values, as we've said in other episodes, first, in the absence of purpose, we distract ourselves or seek pleasure. So there's sort of short-sighted behaviors or decisions that we get caught up in. But the other thing of it is, if we're not clear truly in who we are or what drives us, our values, our priorities, then we tend to inject or take on the values of
Mm.
others, especially those we look up to, right? And I know you and I were speaking about it before the show that, I think I gave you an example of just how different values could be, even if they look similar. So, you and I both value business development in a different form, you could say. And perhaps the way that you express that, with your life by design and, the hours that you choose to work and how you've set that up is going to be different to the way that I do it, right? And so
Mm.
if I wasn't crystal clear on what my business represents to me or the vehicle in which I hope that will, what that will fulfill, how I can use my business as a vehicle, then it will be very easy for me to compare to perhaps how, the freedom that your business offers you, et cetera,
Hmm.
because I'm not clear on my values. And so I'm taking on those idealisms from your values. So, whether it's a career, whether it's family, kids, any area of life, health, wealth, relationships, or career, um, Yes, in the absence of our own certainty with our values, we tend to try and borrow some certainty from
Hmm.
others. And, the problem with that is when we're taking action on things that aren't truly authentic to us, where we're not truly aligned. I mean, ultimately, it's a recipe for disaster or an emotional roller coaster
Mm.
because we're trying to be someone that we're not. We're trying to expect ourselves to take this consistent, authentic action in an area that isn't actually authentic to us. So, whilst I can appreciate, taking inspiration from certain people, perhaps their achievements or successes, it's important that we do take inspiration from it, but not actually take those ideals or those values and try and make them our own if they don't actually correspond with our own voids and our own experiences.
Hmm.
And again, circling back around, going back to what gives you energy, what do you love to learn about, and using these questions that we'll go through in the next episode is going to be crucial to actually sort of fact check that, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, powerful. And do you see that as I imagine that would be a direct correlation to something like burnout or something where people are expending energy in the pursuit of something that they
Mm.
don't genuinely value, or depression or other things. I know it's not just, 1 + 1 = 2 with
Yeah,
those things,
yeah,
but yeah, that if people have imported values, and then like I think that thing you said where if you're not clear on your values, you are much more highly susceptible to take on other people's values.
mm,
Is almost like it is a fundamental thing for your personal health to know your values. Otherwise, you risk taking on others. And there's all these other, like I
yes.
said, depression or burnout or perfectionism and all those things.
Mm.
Do you see that as a really important thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, burnout's a huge topic, and actually, perhaps that's an episode for us in future. Actually, let's lock that in. But yes, I mean, burnout 9 times out of 10 is going to be proportionate to your values, because if you're doing what you love and it truly is energizing and fulfilling and authentic, why do you need to take a break from that, right? And that might sound a bit, surprising or un-PC, to hear, oh, well, we need breaks and we need to, mix it up and have other areas of our life. But I would actually suggest, no, it does come down to our values and what's most important. Now, that again, like anything, can be very slippery. It could be that we start and we love our business or we love our family or whatever area of life or certain parts of it. But it might be that, as we, maybe get complacent or as we build out the business or whatever's important to us, that we might find there's certain expectations or roles that we perceive we have to take on, or our customers or other
Hmm.
people's values. And so you'll find that with every client that I've worked with that's ever sort of been burnt out, and actually looking at what got them to that point, it tends to be, again, going back to all the things they think they should do.
Mm.
Now, maybe the things that they think they should do are still part of their vision for their life, but perhaps the way they're going about it or the timeline, or these expectations, again, that's got a injected values element, right?
Yeah.
In the same way that perhaps I love working with clients, but maybe there's an injected value of I have to see a certain amount of clients a week. So it can be very slippery with the expectations that we put on ourselves. But yes, burnout, depression, all of these mental health outcomes are going to be symptoms in many cases of unfulfilled or incongruent values.
Mm. Just a story from the other day. I was chatting with a friend, and he said he and his business partner both say they value family,
Mm,
but they value family in different ways.
mm,
One feels that they should be, or they not that they should, feels a need to be at all events,
mhm,
and so will stop work at a child's event and go. The other will say, well, I do value family, but it doesn't necessarily look like that in the same way.
mm,
Just back to what you said around, you can say, yeah, I value family, or I had a good family, but there's still a void that you're looking to fill in some
mhm,
way.
mhm.
Yeah. Could you speak to the kind of the difference of, the void that happens where you might have the same value. We both value family,
Mm.
or we both value freedom, or we value honesty, or whatever the thing is, but it looks different.
Yeah.
Is there very like real nuance around the void that leads to a very specific type of value?
Yeah, well, that's a specific question. I love that. Perhaps if I start broad and then I'll go more specific. So yes, crucial to understand that, like we said earlier, you and I could both value business, but the way in which we go about it, or the why, what it truly represents, can obviously be different and be expressed differently. So, yes, and using that example of family, it could be that one. If we use a man as an example, stereotyping, of course, but it could be that one father that he perceives, he is prioritizing his family or his children by working 60, 80 hours a week, right?
Sure.
Or taking on all of those challenges and trying to, get ahead for their financial goals. It could be a different father with seemingly similar values on family, could be, not expecting himself to work those hours, but actually be creating the travel and the experiences with the kids and that real
Mm.
quality time. So for those two individuals, both of them could be driven, seemingly by that same word, family. But what it the way that it unfolds looks obviously completely different. And yes, to your point, the way that it unfolds is going to be based on our voids and is going to be based on our past experiences.
Mm.
And so, to give a practical example there, it could be that, if one individual had the perception or a void that they perceived that, they had a challenging childhood because they didn't have, any money, or they perceived that, their friends had bikes growing up and they didn't have those sort of things, then they could have a void around, not being able to have those experiences or that lifestyle growing up. Now, the way that they internalize that void and the way that they internalize those memories is going to be different to the individual and could dictate whether they then have a higher value on the wealth building and prioritizing that for the family, or whether they have a higher value on actually experiences and getting out and being there with the kids. So there's probably no black or white answer to that other than
Mm.
saying that you're right, that we could have similar values on paper. So it's not really about the word, it's
Mm.
about what that looks like and the vision driving you forward. Vision drives decision, is what I say. Um, but yes, again, they're going to come from voids and they're going to come from our specific voids and the way that we internalized it, or like anything, we've said this in other episodes, the meaning that we make out of things.
Yeah, I got a specific example from what you're talking about. It's landing because my father tells a story of being the one kid that couldn't go on the school trip
Oh,
and not being
well,
able to
there you
afford
go.
it, and then has worked incredibly hard
Mm,
and done incredibly financially, but worked really hard. Would call himself workaholic, and
mm,
then you get myself and my brother really prioritizing time with
mm,
family, actual time
mhm,
together. And you go, well, you can see generational voids and values playing out
And even
over
perhaps some
time.
generational trauma there. I'm sorry to interrupt, Greg,
Yeah.
but one of the things that I find with clients, and I wasn't going to get into this today because got a lot to cover, of course, but two things can be true at the same time. So we can obviously value something that is highly purposeful and meaningful, rewarding to us, but it doesn't mean that it can't also be infused with some past pain that we're
Hmm.
desperately trying to avoid. And so often cases, in fact, I would say 9 times out of 10, when I'm working with a client, yes, they're not clear on their values. And so the first thing is we need to get clear on that. But secondary to that, we also need to look at, what are the past dynamics of pain that are keeping them stuck from expressing those values maximally or
Right.
expressing those values more fully. And, perhaps an example of that, this is just an example, and I don't know your father, obviously, but I think there'll be a message in this for someone listening is, it could be that I would suggest he truly values the family and, uh, and the financial side of things, probably specifically, and obviously they interrelate for him. And so he is prioritizing, working, etc., and having less of those experiences to fulfill his value and to benefit the family.
Hmm.
But it doesn't mean at the same time that he's not carrying pain personally, that he wasn't able to have perhaps those certain experiences or have those nice things or the bikes, whatever it is, meaning that he might be actioning or taking action on his value to provide for the family financially, but perhaps missing certain opportunities along the way to have those experiences, which is essentially is being held hostage by some of that pain in the past, right? So
Right.
when I work with clients, the frame that I use is we're looking for what is going to be the most effective and efficient way to fulfill your values, not just justify, okay, I need to
This
work.
happened in my past, so this is what I'm going to do now. It's
Mhm.
Is that best serving you to fulfill your genuine value now.
100%.
Yeah.
And also, our values change and evolve over time. And so, it could be that, for the first 2 or 3 years of, being a new father or a new husband, it could be
Mm.
that, all right, we've got to get some investing and we've got to get the financial situation locked down. And maybe, any individual could fulfill that and they build that up. And then it could be great. Okay, now going back to that highest value of family or the children, is this still the
It looks
best
different.
way to fulfill that, right?
Mm.
And our values change over time with either big life events or as we fulfill them. And so, that could be very nuanced. Again, it might not be that our value on family completely changes, but again, the way that we express that. And so, every now and then when I have a client, they might come back to me a year later after doing the initial 6 sessions, perhaps, and oftentimes, what happens is they're frustrated because their values have changed or evolved slightly. They're taking the same actions, not getting the same outcomes, not feeling as fulfilled. And they're frustrated because they haven't recognized that their values have changed or evolved as they're fulfilled or sort of ticked
Mm.
off, in a sense, a certain part of it. So, a lot in that, Greg, but long-winded way of saying that yes, the voids are certainly going to be driving the values. The expression of the values is going to be different person to person. And again, going back to the comparisons, it's crucial that we are clear on what does it look like for us. Hence, there's a whole process to get clear on this. And lastly, in terms of, yes, how even your father's experiences can shape your values. Now, that's not shaping your values through last thing I'll say, then I'll throw it back to you. Not shaping your values through, all right, my father valued this, so I must value this,
Right.
right? That's clearly what we've said wouldn't be authentic. That would be an injected value or idealisms. But you could say influencing you through your father's experiences and his values, setting up his actions, which create, your home environment, which then drive your own perceptions of
Mhm.
what you perceive as most missing or unfulfilled for you. So, like anything, there's a chain reaction in life, but it does always come down to how you perceive it, which is an amazing thing because perhaps an understanding that it comes down to your perceptions and the stories you tell yourself. We often have more power over these things than what we realize.
It's a great place to segue to the second topic we're going to talk about, or the second section, I think, is how do our values shape our emotions
Mm.
or shape our perceptions?
Mm. Yeah, absolutely, Greg. And I know in a previous episode I touched on very briefly, so I'll hash this out a bit more now, how there's actually, we have the prefrontal cortex, the forebrain, and then we have the amygdala, right? Now, when we are doing what's most meaningful to us, we're living our values, we're living our purpose priorities, the blood, the glucose, the oxygen comes all the way up to the forebrain, right? And that's where basically we have the most self-governance, we have the most objectivity. So we're not being run by our emotions, okay, or our amygdala, the fight or flight center. We have the self-governance, we're making long-term strategic decisions. So it's interesting because, everyone talks about mental health, mental health, mental health. And, clearly I'm a proponent of that. But obviously I'm more of a proponent of the values and what gives you a purpose. Because also, as we've discussed in previous episodes, is happiness a wise goal, or actually is purpose or meaning going to be more sustaining? And second to that, thinking about how you set yourself up in life, both physically and mentally, when you're doing what's most important to you, you have more self governance, you're more objective, you're less black and white, is a very good way to think about it. Okay. And you embrace challenges differently, both in your buy into wanting to embrace the challenges. If you're doing something that you love, you have a challenge and you're prepared to overcome it, right? If I have a difficult client, I don't get frustrated, I get curious, right? Because I value the process of problem solving. But with my accounting, you could say, Matt, my accountant, sorry if you're listening. But with my accounting, I don't have that same level of resilience or adaptability, or I might be
Mm.
more likely to get frustrated and give up. Now, that's not because I'm someone that's inherently lazy or not motivated. It's because when you're not living what's most important to you, you're not tapping into that forebrain where you're thinking long term and you tend to default more to these primitive fight or flight, seek or avoid, black and white thinking systems. So, knowing our values is crucial for self governance and having self awareness. But it's also crucial for ensuring that you're putting yourself in the right position in life that will then set up the mental health outcomes, right? To kind of bring a couple of things we've spoke about together today, Greg, or full circle, is imagine if you weren't clear on your values, so you're borrowing other people's values or ideals, or you're taking actions on things that you think may impress other people or look good, again, not your values. Well, A, is that going to be fulfilling? But B, how much more likely are you to actually give up in the pursuit of that or get frustrated or not have that same level of due diligence or organization required? And again, that's not because you're not that person, but because it's not actually truly your values.
Mm.
So if you were operating under that wrong paradigm where you're not clear on your values, you're not taking values aligned actions, then how likely are you to get depressed when you're not actually able to actually bring some of those goals to fruition? So, depression, burnout, imposter syndrome, all comes back to values.
Yeah, an example comes to mind of two different tennis players. One who's doing it because they want to win and
Mhm.
they're trying to be the best, or they feel like they should. Another just loves the game.
Mm,
And to them, practice, when you get practice meets skill, meets fun and enjoyment, they're not going, oh, is training done?
mm,
They're just, I'm back out there and I'm playing. Like that person isn't even playing against you
mhm,
as much as they are just, they're,
mm,
they're, they're living aligned with their values and what
mm,
they enjoy.
mm,
A specific question around perception, because you mentioned there the story that in the previous section, that different people may tell themselves a slightly different story
mhm.
given a similar perceived void from the outside. They might tell themselves something different. They might have a different value as a result. How different is I think for the listeners, just the idea of like where an emotion might come from, or like the stories that we tell ourselves? Because my understanding would be that we have something happen, we then have a story that we tell ourselves
Mm,
around what that means for us,
mm,
and then that then generates the related emotion that we experience, whether positive, negative, or otherwise.
mhm.
Would you agree with that process, or do you see it as something different around like how our values or the stories we tell ourselves then shape how we
Yeah.
feel?
Yeah, look, I mean that's a big topic. I wouldn't say that anything you said there, I there's nothing that stood out to me that I disagreed with there. It's probably I just said maybe that there's levels to that, right? Or nuance to that. So, even in what you just described there, we go through a challenge, we internalize it, we'll make meaning out of it. Well, first of all, that's a moment for us to associate or create a void, right? Which then can set up what's meaningful to us in the short or long term. Um, but the other angle to it, perhaps to integrate, is that when we are living our values and we are taking action on what's most important to us, we're less likely to come up with a black or white negative story that keeps us in these loops, right?
Okay.
Because again, we're more resilient, we're more adaptive, we're willing to put in the work or and achieve in that way. And so it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy where, when you are living your values and you're naturally more engaged and more brought in, and like I said, you're using that forebrain, so you're less black and white, you tend to embrace the challenges differently, and you can integrate, as we've said in the earlier episodes, that pain and pleasure in pursuit of the purpose. And so when you're living from your values, you'll find that things tend to compound, you could say positively.
Mm.
But when you're unclear on your values and you're putting yourself in situations or you're in an environment that isn't fulfilling, that isn't inspiring, then you'll find that, with each challenge that you come up with, you're perhaps more likely to internalize that in more of a sort of black or white threat based association, which, further compounds the negative mental health outcomes. Okay. Fortunately, it would be wise to actually consider, those outcomes as physiological feedback, that you aren't actually living your values, right?
Right.
These things that we have called emotions. I want to make it very clear they're certainly not bad things. They're feedback to us, right? And in many cases, the more emotional we are, perhaps could be feedback of how aligned with our values we are, right? Because if we're certain about something, we don't need to be emotional. Or, like I said, if you were to challenge me or push back on something, if I'm authentic and speaking about what I love, maybe we're having a healthy debate or going back and forth, but I don't need to get emotional about it. So,
And
uh,
just to clarify, when you're saying emotional, because you're also saying emotions are really important.
mm,
I mean, we're both. If I were to stereotype, we're both male. White. on the show talking about emotions and saying, that there's a logical part of the brain. But what, and this is part of personal journey, is trying to like re-tap into joy, re-tap into that energy that you say is natural with your values. Just for the listeners, you're not saying logical brain is good, emotions are bad.
Mm,
You're saying like an emotional reactive
mm,
response that is framed in the negative, as in a knee jerk reaction, or I'm not choosing what that's more what you
mm.
mean around not being emotional
Yeah.
rather than like not having emotions. Yeah.
I love that distinction. That is absolutely perfect. I mean, consider it that the emotions are feedback for us on what our perceptions reveal, right? And perhaps where we can make refinements to be more authentic.
Right.
Okay, so yes, it's not. It would be very unrealistic to set up this fantasy that we don't have emotions, that we are self-governed, that we make very clinical decisions all the time. As much as that is a symptom of a positive symptom, I guess you could say, in terms of being aligned, that you're able to bypass a lot of that emotional turbulence or uncertainty that many of us have. When those emotions do come up, I would suggest asking, what does this mean? What does this represent?
Mm.
I mean, probably the most obvious way to think about it would be is when our values are being challenged or not supported is generally going to be when we're going to have the most pushback or the most
Mm.
emotional turbulence that comes up. That or we're hitting a wound that triggers something in the past.
Yeah. Right.
Mm. And so I guess just bringing this full circle, Greg, for this question, I believe, or this segment, which was around the emotional side of things and mental health, emotional health, self awareness, is understanding our values will give us the greatest probability of actually putting ourselves in the right position to then have more favorable mental health outcomes
Yeah.
and ultimately actually start compounding things in a more sustaining direction where we're taking values aligned decisions. And like I said earlier in earlier episodes, when we're taking action on our values, we actually integrate the challenges and the pain differently than if we're doing low priority things, we tend to suffer.
Now, I might be putting you on the spot a little bit here, but would you be able to give an example of exactly that? So, say the same thing happens to two different people,
Mhm.
and one person knows their values, how they might see that differently, and how that is experienced, not necessarily positively, but as a further enablement of their values and their vision, versus someone who isn't clear on their values, and maybe how that then becomes a negative defining loop or something like that. I don't know if you've got an example that could
Yeah, yeah.
show
I
that?
mean, maybe if I'll, it is on the spot, but I love it. Maybe I'll speak for myself a little bit. I know that, um, obviously, with me valuing problem solving, reaching more people in my own business, and this has been a journey like anything. But if there's a challenge in my business, maybe it's some technology or Zoom from online calls, or there was a while ago where the software we were using for sending confirmation messages for people stopped working, that sort of thing, right? And I remember, that came up, and it was quite a stressful day where basically half my clients didn't show up because they didn't get their confirmation messages. But for me and myself, knowing that my client work is so deeply important, I've just launched my services in the states. I think we said in a prior episode, and so me actually being able to integrate that challenge in a more useful and more meaningful way, and going, okay, it's broken, it's not ideal, the confirmation text messages, but actually, how is this actually going to serve my values? How is this going to serve my business? And immediately I was great. Okay, I can see how we're going to put in place X, Y, and Z, and that's going to actually make this a better offering, a better, more professional
Mm.
service in the long run. Now, if I wasn't clear on my values, or let's say I'm doing my job, but I'm not fulfilled from my job, I hate my job, or I don't love it, then you can imagine if you have a challenge or a setback like that, it's going to be very hard or much harder to find meaning in that. It's just going to be a day where things went wrong,
Yeah.
and you can't associate any purpose with that. So, just obviously a small example from me and my own business, but yes, I know that when I have something that challenges me in business, and being clear on my values, I'm able to more quickly frame it in a way of actually how can I improve my product? How can I reach more people? Because I'm clear on that problem solving value.
Great.
Mm.
Yeah, and I can imagine at the extreme end, if something like that happened and you weren't clear on your values,
Mm.
or you were really outer directed rather than inner directed, that
Mhm.
you could end up in a bit of a loop and say, oh, well, this means I don't know how to run a business. And therefore that
Yes.
means that maybe I shouldn't be doing this, and
Yes.
maybe I'm stupid. And
Mm.
but you could go right the way down
Yeah.
to, having a horrible day that, you know,
Well, that's another great example, Greg, of going back to how the values drive the mental health outcomes, right?
mm,
Because, already we've just said, all right, if I'm taking actions aligned with my values, there's a challenge because, there's no avoiding suffering in life, there's no avoiding it. But again, the way I respond to that challenge, because I'm perceiving there's meaning, right? Or there's an opportunity there, it doesn't trigger all of those perhaps negative beliefs or past patterns or self-sabotage, which we all have. We all
mm.
get caught up in that. So it allows us to sort of transcend that and again focus more on the purpose and the mission. So like I said earlier, I think, when we're clear on our values, we can compound our life in a more sustaining way versus when we are not clear on our values or we're putting ourselves in a position trying to be someone that we're not. When we come up against a challenge or a pain, or something doesn't go to plan, so much of our other triggers, wounds, negative self-talk all unravels
Mm.
and it compounds in that direction.
A great takeaway from me in that section is the fact that if we're experiencing a bunch of negative emotion or negative looping,
Mm,
that could be an invitation to explore what our real values are, and maybe a signal that we're not living from our true values.
mm,
A great way to have a look at the emotions we're experiencing as a bit of a signal.
mm.
I think it'd be a great place to transition to our third section of this, which is, how do our values actually affect our behavior, our patterns of being and interacting?
Yeah, huge. And look, I mean, we've touched a lot on this. A lot of jumping around because it all relates. Obviously, Greg, we touched a lot on this today already around which direction are we compounding in, right? Are we compounding in this sort of the same old loops that are being brought out, or are we actually embracing the challenges and building our life, which is the core tenet of the show? I think one good example of how the values dictate our physical behavior would be procrastination, right? I know we've spoke about even doing an episode on it in the future, but when we are expecting ourselves to take action on something that truly is a lower priority or doesn't have that inherent meaning to us, or we don't have that buy-in, we are naturally going to procrastinate. Okay. It's not because we're lazy or there's something wrong with us or we're incapable. It's because we live by a set of values, a set of priorities. Whether we can articulate these values or not, they're there. And when we're expecting ourselves to act on something that isn't those values, there's going to be some inner conflict, some pushback. Okay, similar to burnout that we said before as well, right? There's this physiological
Mm.
pushback, in the body and that inner conflict. So I think procrastination, is obviously one of it. The flip side of that is, high performance. I work a lot with high performers, that sort of thing. And, even those individuals, from experience, I've never worked with anyone that couldn't be more clear on their values. But often it's on a continuum, right? And so perhaps certain individuals or high performers might be a little bit more clear on their mission, or their vision for their company, maybe less clear on the personal values. But there's some sense of connection, to their values or their purpose on some level. And so um, the clearer that you are on the values, the more bold your actions will be. I mean, if you were to look at perhaps even obviously polarizing figure these days, but Elon Musk, that sort of thing, hate him or love him. I mean, he clearly perceives that he's on a mission and he's got certain things in his vision that he's looking to fulfill.
Mhm.
And so it's hopefully obvious that I do not believe that anyone would think he could do those 80, 90, 100-hour weeks if that wasn't associated with a clear vision. Okay. So whether it's procrastination and avoidance and not, taking action, or whether it's, you're a high performer or you want to be a high performer, you want to be more engaged, more fulfilled, more consistent, the values will dictate that energy output or that avoidance. That would be one example of the behaviors.
Yeah, really relatable one, I'm sure, with procrastination for everyone who's listening in different areas.
Mm,
I'm really curious about that one too, because what happens where you are trying to do something new, and you experience resistance to it, or say for example, you want to finish a book
Mhm.
and you're going, hey, I really value finishing, I think I value finishing this book, or writing a book, or difficult tasks. Um, would you say that someone needs to explore how you're doing something maybe that you don't truly value? What do you really value?
Mm.
Or are there sometimes where procrastination kicks in because it's hard, but you
Yes.
do value it?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a discernment thing for me, and I'm sure for other listeners, is you want to know which one it is.
Mm.
Either own the fact you don't value this and so
Mhm.
choose a slightly different direction, or you do lack character and follow through. But if you
Mhm.
get that wrong, right? If
Mhm.
you're just going beating yourself over the back or trying to be like, hey, you need to have follow through,
Yeah.
but you don't value it, I mean, that's a path to burnout as
Mm.
well, or whatever. So
So I mean, I personally love the first part you just set up there, which is, if you don't value it, own that,
mm,
right? Which I think is huge. And just before I answer the question, I mean, how liberating is it, or can it be? I'm sure that everyone can relate to this at some point, where they just get to a point, intention or unintentionally, of, okay, I'm not going to conform to this, or it's not who I am, or I'm not going to put this expectation on myself. So, I just wanted to
sure,
own that myself, just actually how much is in what you just said there, Greg, about owning what isn't your values. Or, another version of that, perhaps, mate, could be owning where you're expecting something to be the highest priority, where it isn't the highest priority.
right,
And, a good example of that, maybe just quickly, for an example, would be myself. And I think I've said on a couple of episodes, I've got three young kids now. Um, a 9-year-old, a 9-month-old girl, sorry, and a 2.5-year-old boy. And I very consciously recall making the call, that I was not prepared to go backwards with my clients and my business work. When over the last couple of years, and when we've had these multiple children. And the reason that that's relevant is I gave myself permission to not be as empowered with my health and fitness. Okay. So I knew my values hierarchy. I knew that, problem solving and building my business and reaching more people is important. My own self development understanding is important. My family's clearly very important. And then my lower value was the health and fitness, which I'd previously been very disciplined and focused with. And so me knowing my values, I'm not saying this was, there wasn't some in a challenge, because there always is with these things, but me knowing that, yes, I do value the health and fitness, but what do I value higher than that? And what is that order of those values, allowed me to overcome those expectations and actually say, you know what? I'm perhaps not going to, train the 4 or 5 times a week that I've essentially trained for the last 6 or 7 years. I'm actually going to take that time and make sure that I can be there for my family and my kids, and move the business forward as it needs to be. So if I wasn't clear on that order of my values and what's
hmm,
higher priority versus lower priority, I would suggest either I would be beating myself up because I can't achieve in all of these areas, which is an unrealistic expectation, or I would be, putting my health first at the cost of my family, or my health first at the cost of the business, which isn't proportionate to my values hierarchy. Okay. Um, so I've probably taken us way off track there,
no,
Greg.
that's the first part there of owning, I think, where you don't value something, or choosing in this season, these are my values, this is what I'm
Mhm,
going to do, and
mhm,
accepting limits,
mm,
saying I can't do everything,
mm,
but you have a values hierarchy and saying this is what this looks like, and that's okay. And I think that's liberating for the
yeah,
listeners to say, this. I know I've definitely done that at certain times. It's really, sometimes I've needed someone else to kind of
mhm,
verbally give me
mhm,
permission
yep,
to not hold on to something, or
mhm,
try and care about something I actually don't. And they
yeah,
say, hey, what if you didn't do that anymore?
mm.
What if you, whether it's business or a role or something else?
Well, just to
So that's
clarify,
big.
it would have been impossible for me to do that, and for me to give myself permission to prioritize the family and the business, et cetera, in that way. If I wasn't clear and conscious of my values, I would suggest it would have been a lot more suffering for me trying to
Trying to
be
do it all.
trying to be everything for everyone, or trying to achieve in all my values, which is it wouldn't have been sincere or sustainable at that season of my life. So, just setting everything up today, and even with next week, with going through the actual process. Um, I live and breathe this, obviously, but if I
Mm,
wasn't crystal clear on that, I would suggest that there would have been a lot more inner conflict there during that
yeah.
time for me.
I do want to dive into the second part of that if we can,
Mm,
which is around the procrastination piece, because I'm sure it would be really common for listeners. And I imagine in hearing what's been said so far, people say, if I'm procrastinating, I simply don't value it. So I should have a look at that.
That's right.
Is there
Yes.
is there another scenario? I'm thinking of someone trying to go to the Olympics maybe and they
Mhm.
don't want to train one
Mhm.
day or a week or that sort of thing. Where there's a time that we're just, yeah, keen to get your thoughts on
Yeah.
you do value something, but you're struggling to execute or have the behavior that backs up what you value.
Mhm.
Like what would you say is going on there for someone?
Yeah, brilliant, and thank you for reapproaching that one. It's a beautiful question. So like everything, there's layers to that. I think if we assume that the first part is obviously going to be taking the time to be clear on one's values, and as we set up earlier today, Greg, being clear on what that value truly means and looks like. If there's some vague word like, "Oh, I value business," well, for what? What does that look like? What do you value about business? Is it the people? Is it the relationships? Is it the product? Is it serving more people? Or maybe you only value business because you value the wealth building, which is fine. Give yourself permission for that, but let's own it, to use your word,
Mm,
right?
mm,
So the first part, without repeating myself too much, is going to be being clear on what that value actually is, and then checking that the expectation that you're putting on yourself is, in fact, aligned with that. Okay. And that may sound obvious, but there's a lot in there. So, for example, another example for myself is I often get asked to do speaking, right? And in the right scenario, I can really value and find a lot of purpose in speaking or keynotes or workshops. But if I perceive that it's just a tick the box thing for some business that wants to bring me in, or maybe I have the perception that the organization isn't run in a in a wise way, and it's the team aren't going to have that impact, then for me there's probably going to be some pushback because I value problem solving and creating solutions, and I don't perceive that I will be put in the right environment to do
mm,
that. Now imagine if I didn't have again that clarity in my values and what that problem solving value looks like. I might be taking on all these speaking opportunities and then finding all this pressure and inattention because I'm not preparing for it, etc. Because my time is naturally going to my clients and where I do perceive I can solve high level problems,
mm.
right? So just full circle here on this example for myself in knowing my value on problem solving, I was able to create a clearer sort of, basically a checklist, Greg, on if I'm to do some work with an organization,
Mm,
what is their leadership, what is their team, and basically having clearly defined goals for that. And in me being clear on that, I'm able to overcome that procrastination, right? So just a little example there, Greg, just about how much value there is in auditing exactly what the value is, but then exactly what the goal or expectation is. Because I would probably say 9 times out of 10, there's a incongruency there. And remember, I said earlier, you can sort of justify anything. You could make an association of how, working 100 hours a week is the best thing for your family, or it's the worst thing for your family, right? Depending on the story you tell yourself, right? So I think we can justify X goal in theory could support X value, but actually looking deeper into that. The second angle to it, which I think is really where you were probably alluding to, is going back to what I've said a couple of times today, which is two things can be true at the same time. So we can truly value something, but it could also be that we do have past fears or past experiences where we failed, and then of course the psyche is trying to help us avoid being in a position again, like where we have in the past, where we perhaps perceive we've associated pain around failing or maybe saying the wrong thing, etc. So I think 9 times out of 10, it is going to be the clarity and the values and making sure that expectation is aligned and also clearly defined. If it's too vague and not broken down or maybe too ambitious,
mm.
it's harder to associate and link. But the other angle, which I believe is what you're speaking to, is actually identifying what's the uncomfortable feeling or the fear here that might be coming up. And, I think I once heard Tim Ferriss actually say that rather than defining goals, he likes to define fears.
Fear setting, yeah, I've heard that.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
And so, I haven't actually watched the clip for full disclosure, but I saw the thumbnail, and my takeaway of that, or my thoughts, or the meaning that I would make out of that for the viewers, is that if you can be conscious of what those fears are, right, or what those blocks or avoidance patterns are, even better where they come from, then you can sort of contrast that to your values. So you could go, okay, this is the value. It is most important to me. It is sincere. This is the goal. I can see how this goal would fulfill what's most important to me. But also over here, there's this uncomfortable feeling that's coming up. Okay. And to own that, but to contrast how staying the same would in fact not support the values, and it would actually in fact challenge
Mm.
your values. Okay. So long-winded way of saying there's layers to that. You need to be clear on the values, clear on the goal or expectation. And then what else is with what else may come up, fears, mental blocks, procrastination, avoidance, try and name that, identify where it comes from, and create a big, I think the more clearly that you can, I mean, I've heard someone say, name it, blame it, tame it, right? So if you know what it is, then you can blame that and you can start, essentially taming it by going, hold on, I know where this takes me. This isn't aligned with my values.
Mm.
What are the costs of staying the same?
Yeah. Yeah, it's powerful. What I'm hearing there is that if you've got procrastination, and this is just one example, I'm sure of lots of behaviors that you would see with clients, is one of the invitations to just explore it and
Mm,
have a look at, if I explore procrastination from a values aligned question, is it aligned, and is there permission for me to say it simply isn't? I'm going to do something different, or
mm,
this is going to be a no for me.
mm,
And I heard you say as well, increasing the criteria of your decision making. That once you're really clear on your values, you actually increase the specificity of, like a speaking gig.
mm,
Well, it needs to be a values aligned organization. They need to be
mhm,
able to implement the
mhm,
problem solving value. Actually, makes the, if there's procrastination or I'm not sure, because it was just a general value as opposed to specific.
mm,
The other part that you mentioned was the being able to have a look at your values and realizing these actually are my values.
yes.
I do care about this.
Mm,
And the fear of staying the same or
mm,
being able to contrast that is an invitation to recommit
mm,
and just to double down. Yeah, it's hard. I don't want to train today. I'm procrastinating, but by revisiting values,
yes.
I do really, it can really
Yes.
add more resolve.
Yes.
And either you say, no, I don't.
Mm,
I'm giving up on the Olympics. I'm not going anymore. Or that still is what I want. I'm going to double down and like redeciding, re-choosing from a place of consciousness
yes.
as opposed to reacting.
And it also gives you the opportunity to become more conscious of the physiological feeling between the two, between that fear and that uncertainty, right? Versus what you truly value and what would be so meaningful and rewarding and
Mm,
inspiring. And so again, I think in defining what those fears are, that yes may be conflicting with the values, it does put you in a position where you can go, all right, I can see the two, where do I want to act from? And you know what we say, right? Acting from design, not default. And what
mm,
a perfect example of that.
yeah. And we've covered so much great stuff today with a values episode. I'm glad that we've done this first one.
Mm,
And for the listeners, just recapping, covering what are values
mm,
and where they come from, how they affect our emotions, how they affect our perceptions, and then how they also affect our behaviors with lots of different, there's lots of different paths that it can take. And I know we've just scratched the surface, but
mm.
hopefully really helpful for the listeners. Is there some last thoughts or a summary of these that you want to leave the listeners with if they've listened to the whole episode up till now?
I think I'm almost careful to not get me going again too much, Greg, or we'll be here another hour. But I think the key message for me would be giving yourself permission to take the time
Mm,
to get clear on what are the things that really drive you, that give you that sense of purpose. Because people don't do that. My average client is 40, 50, and they don't know their values. And that would be the same with the 18, the 20, the 30-year-old. They also don't know. So giving yourself permission to actually take the time. I mean, what have you got to do that's more meaningful than that?
I agree. Yeah, I'm definitely going to go away and take that time and relook at my values. I've got a lot of takeaways that I'm going to work on, hopefully for the listeners as well.
Yeah, beautiful. So thank you for tuning in for Values Part 1. Please do make sure, give yourself the time, the permission, as we were just saying, to look at the following episode 2 and 3, how to clarify your values, and then ultimately how to start building your life around it. Okay. If you got value, let us know in the comments. See you next episode.